The silverback was already sitting beside the injured ranger when the first broken radio transmission reached the station, and what unsettled the search team most was not that the gorilla had come so close, but that it seemed unwilling to leave. Caleb Mercer lay on his side beneath a stand of wet pines, one boot twisted awkwardly against the muddy slope and his handheld radio resting nearly 10 feet away. He could see Baku through the thin veil of rain, broad shoulders dark with water, knuckles planted in the leaves, head angled toward the forest as if listening for something Caleb could not hear. The gorilla was close enough that Caleb could make out the slow movement of his chest, yet Baku never touched him. That was the first thing that made the situation feel wrong. Caleb had spent years learning not to project human intentions onto wildlife, so he kept his breathing steady and avoided direct eye contact. When he shifted one elbow toward the radio, Baku rose. Not with a charge, not with a display, but with one measured step that placed his body directly across Caleb's path. Caleb stopped. Baku stopped too. For several seconds, the rain tapped against Caleb's jacket and nothing else moved. Then the silverback turned his head away from Caleb and stared at the ground several feet downslope. Caleb followed his gaze but saw only leaves, slick dirt, and a narrow strip of exposed clay. He tried moving again. Baku stepped across him a second time. Back at the ranger station, Owen Barrett leaned closer to the speaker as a burst of static broke through. "Caleb, repeat your location." Nothing came back except a faint crackle. Caleb's last GPS ping had placed him near an old service ridge, a section rarely used except during fence inspections after storms. Dana Holloway pulled a rain shell over her uniform and marked the coordinates on a paper trail map while two other rangers loaded a medical pack and stretcher into the utility vehicle. No one at the station knew Baku was there. Caleb did, and the longer the gorilla stayed, the harder it became to dismiss the behavior as simple curiosity. A low branch shifted somewhere behind him. Baku's posture changed immediately. His shoulders tightened, his head lifted, and he moved 3 feet closer to Caleb without looking at him. Caleb felt a cold pressure settle in his stomach. There had been no threat display, but there was unmistakable alertness now. He reached slowly toward the whistle clipped to his vest, wondering whether using it would help the search team or provoke the animal beside him. Before his fingers touched it, Baku gave a short, deep vocalization and turned sharply toward the slope. Caleb froze. A few pebbles rolled past his sleeve. Then another small clump of mud slipped from beneath the leaves and disappeared over the edge below. For the first time, Caleb noticed a thin crack running through the soaked ground between him and the radio. It had not been there when he fell, or at least he had not seen it. He stared at the radio again. 10 feet suddenly looked much farther. Baku lowered himself back to the ground, still positioned between Caleb and the cracked section of earth. Caleb's working theory changed. Maybe the gorilla was not blocking him at all. Maybe Baku was reacting to something about the slope. But that raised a worse question: if the unstable ground was the only reason, why was Baku still watching the trees behind Caleb? Minutes later, far beyond the ridge, a human voice carried faintly through the wet forest. Baku heard it before Caleb did. The silverback stood, faced the sound, and released a call so powerful that birds lifted from the canopy. Then, instead of moving toward the voices, Baku turned back, stepped beside Caleb, and placed himself directly between the injured ranger and whatever was approaching through the trees. Baku did not advance toward the sound. He stayed where he was, broad back angled toward the trees, one hand resting on the damp ground beside Caleb as if the safest choice was simply to remain still. The gesture was ordinary, almost quiet, and that made it harder for Caleb to understand. Rainwater gathered along Baku's forearm and fell in slow drops from his fur. Every few seconds, the silverback shifted his weight and glanced toward Caleb, never holding the look for long. Caleb noticed a torn strip of yellow survey ribbon caught on a low branch nearby. Baku reached for it once, rubbed it between two fingers, then let it fall. The movement was so careful that Caleb found himself watching the gorilla more than the distant voices. For a moment, the urgency around him softened. Baku seemed less like a threat and more like an animal trying to make sense of an unfamiliar situation. Then he picked up a small pine cone, turned it over in his palm, and placed it beside Caleb's boot. Caleb almost smiled. It was not a gift. He knew better than to call it that. It was simply an object Baku had inspected and abandoned. Still, the tiny action felt strangely personal in the silence. Caleb whispered, "Easy," though he was not sure whether he was speaking to Baku or to himself. The gorilla's eyes moved toward Caleb's voice, then toward the broken radio across the cracked ground. That glance lasted a little too long. Caleb followed it and felt the curiosity return. Baku had ignored the radio earlier, but now he seemed aware of it. A faint burst of static came from the speaker. Baku flinched, not dramatically, but enough to make his shoulders tighten. He lowered his head and listened until the sound faded. Then, instead of moving away from the unfamiliar noise, he settled closer to Caleb. The change was subtle. Caleb could now hear Baku's breathing beneath the rain. It was slow, measured, almost calming. Several yards away, a thrush hopped through the wet leaves. Baku watched it for a few seconds, then lost interest. His attention returned to the ridge. The normality of those small distractions made Caleb feel an unexpected sadness. Baku was not performing some heroic act. He was simply there, making quiet decisions Caleb could not interpret. That uncertainty made the connection feel more real, and somehow more fragile. A gust of wind pushed a wet leaf against Caleb's sleeve. Baku reached toward it, stopped halfway, and withdrew his hand. Caleb noticed the hesitation. The gorilla had come close enough to touch him more than once, yet each time he had chosen not to. That restraint stayed in Caleb's mind. Why remain beside an injured human while avoiding contact completely? The search voices grew clearer. Baku stood and moved 3 paces uphill, then came back. He repeated the pattern once more, not pacing nervously, but checking the same narrow section of trees. Caleb began to wonder whether the sound was attracting him or troubling him. When Owen's voice carried through the rain, calling Caleb's name, Baku gave no display. He only lowered his head and touched the ground with his fingertips. Then Caleb saw something he had missed before. Fresh impressions marked the mud near Baku's feet, smaller than the silverback's tracks and heading from the trees toward the ridge. Baku looked down at them, then toward the brush. The quiet in his posture changed. Caleb could not explain how, but the gorilla seemed more alert than he had been all afternoon. A soft rustle moved through the undergrowth, too low for Caleb to see what caused it. Baku stepped in front of him again, but this time he was not facing the rescuers. He was facing deeper into the forest. Baku held his position for several seconds, then did something Caleb had not seen him do before. Instead of moving toward the rustling brush, the silverback bent down, swept aside a patch of wet leaves with the back of one hand, and exposed the darker soil beneath. He pressed his knuckles against it, paused, then shifted 3 feet to the left and repeated the motion. Caleb could not tell what he was checking. The behavior looked deliberate, but not in any way he recognized. When Baku finally straightened, he did not watch Caleb or the rescuers. He watched the ground between the ridge and the trees. That was when Dana's voice came through clearly for the first time. She was close enough now that Caleb could hear individual words. "Caleb, call out if you can hear me." He drew in a breath and answered, but his voice came out weak. Baku reacted immediately. He moved uphill, stopped near a fallen log, and gave a short call. Dana answered from somewhere beyond the brush. Caleb expected Baku to retreat from the human response. Instead, the gorilla returned to Caleb, circled behind him, and sat on the opposite side from where he had been before. The change put Caleb between Baku and the approaching search team. That made no sense. If Baku was anxious about the rescuers, why move closer to them? A few minutes later, Owen appeared through the trees nearly 40 yards away. He stopped as soon as he saw the silverback and raised one hand to signal the others behind him. No one rushed forward. Dana joined him, speaking quietly into her radio while watching Baku's posture. The gorilla noticed them but did not display. He picked up a broken branch, dragged it several feet across the mud, and dropped it near the crack in the slope. Owen frowned. "Is he trying to block something?" he asked. Dana did not answer. Baku repeated the action with a second branch, placing it farther downhill. It looked almost like a boundary, but the pieces were uneven and scattered. Caleb knew better than to assign purpose too quickly. Still, every branch ended up near the same unstable strip of ground. Then Baku abandoned them completely and moved toward a cluster of young trees. The search team's attention followed him. For a moment, everyone assumed he was leaving. He was not. He stopped beside one sapling, pulled at a low vine, and released it. The vine snapped back against the trunk with a soft thump. Baku listened. Then he moved to another sapling and did the same thing. Caleb felt the unease return. This was no longer a single odd reaction. The gorilla was sampling the environment in ways that seemed connected, yet the pattern remained impossible to read. Dana quietly told Owen to hold the team at their current distance. "We do not know what he is responding to," she said. Baku turned at the sound of her voice and walked toward Caleb again. Halfway there, he stopped over the smaller tracks Caleb had noticed earlier. He lowered his face close to the mud, sniffed once, then followed the prints for several yards toward the brush. Caleb's first thought was that another gorilla might be nearby. Baku's next movement challenged that idea. He abruptly left the tracks, returned to the ridge, and placed himself beside Caleb's injured leg. Not touching it. Not guarding it. Simply occupying the narrow space beside it. Owen shifted his weight in the distance, and Baku immediately stepped away from Caleb and moved downhill. Dana lifted her hand again, telling everyone to stay still. The gorilla reached the cracked section of earth, tapped the surface twice with his knuckles, then backed away. A thin line of mud collapsed into the hollow below. Nobody spoke. Baku turned toward the search team, then toward Caleb, as though caught between two different sources of tension. For several seconds he remained motionless. Then came the strangest act yet. Baku walked to Caleb's radio, which still lay beyond the damaged ground, hooked one long arm around a low tree trunk without stepping onto the unstable soil, reached across the gap, and knocked the radio away from the edge. It slid several feet across the leaves toward safer ground. The speaker crackled as it stopped. Baku did not pick it up. He did not examine it. He simply stepped back, positioned himself between Caleb and the rescuers once more, and gave a low call that made Dana stop moving altogether. Dana kept her hand raised, holding the team in place while she studied Baku's position. The safest option, from her point of view, was not to move closer at all. Caleb was injured, the slope was unstable, and the silverback had repeatedly placed himself in the narrow space between the ranger and the rescue team. None of that meant Baku intended harm, but it did mean one wrong move could make the situation harder. Dana spoke quietly into her radio and requested the Wildlife Response Unit to prepare a diversion route from the east side of the ridge. The plan was simple: draw Baku away from Caleb long enough for the medical team to reach him. It was reasonable. It was also the first time Caleb felt something tighten in his chest for reasons that had nothing to do with his injury. Baku had not left him once. Now the rescuers were preparing to make him leave. Owen unpacked a bright orange equipment bag and began moving several yards to the right, careful not to cross the damaged ground. Baku noticed the change immediately. He did not follow Owen. Instead, he lowered himself beside Caleb again and placed one hand flat against the leaves. His attention shifted toward the east trail before any sound came from that direction. Dana paused. The response unit had not arrived yet, and no one had called out. Caleb noticed it too. "He hears something," he said quietly. Dana looked toward the trees, then back at Baku. For a brief moment, the diversion plan stalled. Then a distant engine started somewhere below the ridge. Baku rose and turned toward it. The team took that movement as their opening. Dana motioned for Lena Brooks to advance 2 careful steps with the medical pack. Baku moved back toward Caleb at once. He did not display. He simply occupied the same narrow strip of ground again, forcing Lena to stop. From the rescuer's perspective, the pattern was becoming clearer. Whenever someone approached Caleb, Baku closed the distance. The conclusion was not cruel or dramatic. They could not safely provide care while he stayed there. Dana made the call to proceed with the diversion. Caleb watched Baku reach for the pinecone he had left near his boot earlier. The gorilla rolled it once beneath his fingers, then pushed it aside without interest. The tiny movement bothered Caleb more than it should have. Baku seemed restless now, but not because of the humans alone. Twice he turned toward the brush where the smaller tracks had disappeared. Twice he returned to Caleb before going more than a few yards. It felt less like refusal and more like unfinished attention. Dana could not build a rescue plan around a feeling. "We have to create space," she said. No one disagreed. A wildlife technician positioned himself farther east and produced a series of familiar feeding sounds used during managed movements at the reserve. Baku's head lifted. For the first time since the search team arrived, he walked away from Caleb farther than 10 feet. Owen exhaled softly. Lena shifted forward. Caleb should have felt relieved. Instead, he watched Baku stop at the edge of the trees and look back. The silverback took one more step toward the eastern sound, then turned around completely. He came back halfway, stopped beside the broken branches near the cracked ground, and touched one of them before facing Caleb again. The rescuers waited. The technician repeated the sound. Baku looked east, then toward the brush, then toward Caleb. 3 directions. 3 different pulls. Dana's expression changed, but only for a second. She still had an injured ranger to reach. The response unit reported that they could establish a temporary holding zone farther downhill if Baku followed the diversion route. It would keep him separated from the rescue site until Caleb was removed. That was the safest choice for everyone, and Dana knew it. Caleb understood too, which made it harder to object. "Do it," he said. Baku moved another few yards toward the east trail. Lena prepared the stretcher straps. Owen cleared a path around the unstable section. The plan was working exactly as intended. Then Baku stopped beneath a cedar, turned back toward Caleb, and gave one short call. It was quieter than before, almost swallowed by the rain. Caleb lifted his head as far as he could. "Baku," he said. The gorilla did not come back. A technician closed the portable gate behind him on the lower trail, completing the separation route. Dana looked at Caleb and gave the signal. "We move now." The decision had been made. Baku would remain contained away from the ridge until the rescue was over, no matter what he had been trying to stay beside Caleb for. Lena moved first, keeping to the firmer ground Owen had marked with strips of orange tape. The stretcher stayed folded until they were close enough to assess Caleb without forcing anyone onto the cracked section of slope. Dana knelt several feet away and asked him simple questions about pain, dizziness, and whether he could feel his toes. Caleb answered, but his attention kept drifting toward the lower trail where Baku had disappeared. The forest felt different without him there. Quieter, but not calmer. Lena checked the mud beside Caleb's boot and noticed that the deepest impressions were not random. Several of Baku's knuckle marks formed a loose line along the outer edge of the damaged soil, almost as if he had repeatedly chosen the same narrow strip of stable ground. That did not prove anything, but it weakened Dana's earlier assumption that he had simply been circling Caleb. Owen crouched near the branches Baku had dragged across the slope. He expected them to be scattered wherever the gorilla had dropped them. They were not. Each one rested within a few feet of a place where the soil had begun to separate. "That is strange," he said, careful not to sound certain. Dana looked over but did not answer. A gorilla could move branches for dozens of reasons. Still, the pattern was becoming harder to dismiss. Lena continued examining Caleb while Dana tested the nearby ground with the end of a trekking pole. Several spots held firm. One section did not. The pole sank deeper than expected, and Dana immediately pulled it back. "Nobody steps there," she said. The team shifted their route uphill. Caleb glanced toward the radio Baku had knocked away earlier. It now rested on solid ground, several feet from the newest crack. For the first time, Owen wondered aloud whether its final position had mattered more than the fact that Baku had touched it. Dana reminded him that they could not assign intention without evidence, but she looked at the radio twice before moving on. A few minutes later, the wildlife technician called from below. Baku was calm inside the temporary holding area, but he was not staying near the food used to guide him there. Instead, he kept moving to the northern side of the enclosure and listening toward the ridge. That behavior could have been simple orientation. It could also have been stress from separation. No one knew. Then the technician added something else. Every time voices carried down from Caleb's location, Baku moved to the same corner and became still. Dana asked whether he was displaying. The answer was no. He was only listening. The detail left an uncomfortable silence over the radio. Lena finished securing Caleb's leg and began preparing him for the stretcher. As Owen cleared leaves from the safest route, he found the smaller tracks again. They did not continue toward the ridge as Caleb had assumed. They curved away from him, crossed behind the cedar trees, and vanished near a shallow drainage channel. Dana studied them briefly. They were too indistinct to identify with confidence, but their direction changed another piece of the puzzle. If Baku had been focused on those tracks, he had not been trying to keep their maker away from Caleb. He had been moving between the tracks, the unstable slope, and Caleb himself. 3 separate points. One repeated pattern. Still no explanation. The stretcher was finally unfolded. Lena and Owen positioned themselves on Caleb's safer side while Dana checked the route one more time. A light rain continued to darken the soil, making every mark clearer. Near the place where Baku had sat longest, Caleb noticed something small pressed into the mud. Not a footprint. Not a branch. A shallow hand-shaped depression beside his sleeve, repeated several times in nearly the exact same spot. Lena leaned closer. At first she thought it was simply where Baku had rested his weight. Then she saw that each impression faced away from Caleb and toward the weakened ground. The spacing was too consistent to look accidental. Dana said nothing. She only turned toward the slope, then toward the lower trail where Baku had been taken, and for the first time since the rescue began, she asked the technician a different question. "When you moved him away, which direction did he keep trying to return to?" Dana's question was answered almost immediately. The technician said Baku had kept returning to the north side of the temporary enclosure, the side closest to Caleb's position, even though the food and open space were behind him. That alone still proved nothing. Then Owen looked again at the marks around Caleb and noticed something the rain had made clearer. Baku's deepest knuckle impressions were concentrated beside the unstable strip of ground, but the lighter ones formed a second path between Caleb and the trees. The branches he had moved followed that same line. Dana slowly traced it with her eyes. It was not random movement. Baku had been repeatedly choosing the firmest route around the weakened slope. Lena tested the soil several feet away and found the same pattern. Where Baku had stepped, the ground held. Where he had avoided, the mud gave more easily. Caleb stared at the cracked earth and remembered every moment he had thought Baku was blocking him. Each time Caleb had tried to move toward the radio, the silverback had crossed in front of him. Each time the ground shifted, Baku had become more alert. The radio itself had been pushed away from the edge, not toward Baku, not toward the trees, but onto firmer ground. The idea settled over the group quietly. Baku had not been trying to keep Caleb trapped. He had been reacting to the same unstable terrain again and again. The realization explained part of the mystery, but not why he had stayed for so long. Then Dana looked toward the smaller tracks near the drainage channel. Owen followed them farther this time, keeping to safe ground, and found where they disappeared into a cluster of ferns. Beyond that point, larger gorilla prints crossed the trail and continued downhill. The smaller tracks had likely belonged to a younger animal moving with the group. Baku had not been focused on a hidden threat in the brush. He had been checking the direction his group had gone while repeatedly returning to Caleb. He could have followed them. He had not. Lena said nothing for several seconds. Wildlife did not make human promises, and no one could know what Baku understood about Caleb's condition. But the pattern no longer looked like territorial behavior, confusion, or fixation. He had been balancing two natural pulls from the beginning, staying aware of his group and remaining near an injured, familiar human in an unstable place. Dana's expression changed as another piece fell into place. The powerful call Baku had given when the search team approached had not been some dramatic signal for help. It was a normal response to distant voices entering his space. But because he kept returning to Caleb afterward, the sound had given the searchers a fixed point to follow through the trees. What they had interpreted as a barrier had become a guide. What they had interpreted as interference had kept Caleb from crawling across dangerous ground. And the strange pattern of checking soil, branches, tracks, voices, and Caleb had never changed. Only the human's explanation of it had. Dana radioed the technician. Open the holding route. Do not bring him back. Just give him the option to leave when he is ready. A few moments later, the answer came softly. Baku had already moved away from the gate and was heading uphill along the trees. Everyone grew still. He did not come close. He stopped at a distance where the forest broke open enough for Caleb to see him. The stretcher straps were secured. Lena gave the signal to lift. Caleb turned his head. Baku stood beneath the dripping branches, glanced once toward the path his group had taken, then back toward Caleb. There was no gesture to interpret, no final act that needed explaining. Just a quiet pause between them. Caleb's face tightened, and he lowered his eyes for a moment. We were the ones who kept getting it wrong, he said. When he looked up again, Baku had already begun walking toward the forest, following the same careful line of solid ground he had chosen all along. For several yards, nobody spoke as the stretcher moved away from the ridge. Caleb kept his head turned toward the trees even after Baku disappeared from view. Dana walked beside him, one hand steadying the frame whenever the trail narrowed, but her attention kept returning to the empty place beneath the dripping branches. Earlier, she had treated Baku as a complication that had to be managed. Now every step away from the ridge made that decision feel heavier. Caleb reached into the pocket of his rain jacket and found the yellow survey ribbon he had tucked there before the fall. A muddy piece had torn loose, matching the strip Baku had handled beside him. Caleb rubbed the wet fabric between his fingers and closed his hand around it without saying anything. Owen noticed but did not ask. A few minutes later, they passed the section where the temporary holding route had been set up. The portable gate stood open now. One of the technicians was quietly folding the panels while Lena checked Caleb's pulse again. Near the edge of the trail sat the food that had been used to draw Baku away. Most of it was untouched. Dana stopped long enough to look at it. The technician gave a small shrug. He never cared much about it, he said. He kept listening uphill. Dana nodded once and resumed walking, but her expression had changed. Caleb looked toward the open gate. For the first time, he understood how little the diversion itself had mattered to Baku. He had followed the sounds, but his attention had remained somewhere else. That thought stayed with Caleb as the team carried him toward the utility vehicle. When they reached a flatter stretch of trail, Owen handed Dana the radio Baku had moved from the unstable ground. Mud filled one side of the casing, and the antenna was bent, but the speaker still produced a faint pulse of static. Dana wiped it with her sleeve and placed it beside Caleb. "You almost went after this," she said. Caleb looked at the scratched plastic for a long moment. "Twice," he answered. Nothing more was needed. Lena tightened one strap on the stretcher, then paused when Caleb placed his good hand over the radio as though it had become something different from a piece of equipment. The team continued downhill. Behind them, a low sound traveled through the trees, distant enough that Owen stopped to make sure he had heard it. Caleb's eyes opened wider. Another quiet call followed, farther away this time. Dana did not identify it or attach meaning to it. She simply turned toward the forest. Through a break in the brush, Baku appeared briefly on a rise nearly 100 feet away. He was no longer alone. Two smaller gorillas moved between the trees behind him, and another adult was partly visible near the ferns. Baku paused while the others continued. Caleb did not wave this time. He only lifted his fingers from the radio and rested them against his chest. Baku remained there for a few seconds, then turned toward his group. The sight seemed to release something Caleb had been holding since the fall. His jaw tightened, and he stared at the wet canvas beneath his hand. "He should have gone with them sooner," he said quietly. Dana glanced at him. Caleb shook his head. But he stayed. Dana looked back toward the rise, now empty. She reached down and squeezed Caleb's shoulder once, careful of the injury. No apology could be offered to an animal that would never understand one, and no speech would improve the moment. At the vehicle, Owen placed the damaged radio in a clear equipment bag instead of tossing it into the general gear bin. Caleb noticed. "Keep that one," he said. Owen nodded and wrote Caleb's name on the label. As the rear doors were prepared, Dana found the muddy yellow ribbon still clenched in Caleb's hand. He opened his fingers and looked at it, then tied the strip carefully around the handle of the bag holding the radio. Far above them, the forest had gone quiet again, but this time Caleb did not look frightened by the silence. He kept one hand on that small piece of yellow ribbon as the team carried him away. Caleb spent the next few weeks recovering at home, but the ridge stayed with him in small, unexpected ways. The damaged radio sat on a shelf near his kitchen window, still sealed in the clear equipment bag with the yellow ribbon tied around the handle. He did not tell visitors much about it. Most days, he simply glanced at it while making coffee, then looked away. At the reserve, Dana changed one thing almost immediately. The old service ridge was closed after every heavy rain until the ground could be checked on foot. No announcement was made. A new line appeared on the morning safety board, written in black marker beneath the weather report. Owen was the first to notice Caleb had asked for copies of the trail maps from that section. He mailed them over without comment. A week later, one came back covered in pencil marks showing where Baku had moved, where the soil had failed, and where the smaller tracks had crossed toward the drainage channel. Caleb was not trying to turn the encounter into something mystical. He was trying to understand what he had missed. Meanwhile, camera traps began picking up Baku farther from the ridge. In one image, he walked behind two younger gorillas through a patch of ferns. In another, he sat beneath a broad tree while the rest of the group fed nearby. Nothing about his behavior looked unusual. That ordinary return to his group brought Caleb more relief than any dramatic reunion could have. Then Dana sent him a photograph that made him study the screen for nearly a minute. Baku was crossing the old service trail, but instead of using the center path, he had chosen the higher edge where the ground remained firm. Caleb enlarged the image and smiled for the first time that morning. Still taking the better route, he murmured. When he was cleared to return on light duty, Caleb did not go straight back into field patrol. He worked from the ranger station, checking radio logs, weather reports, and maintenance requests. The change was frustrating at first. Then he began noticing patterns he had once rushed past. A drainage report from 2 months earlier mentioned soft soil near the same ridge. A maintenance note described repeated washout after storms. None of it proved Baku understood unstable ground the way a ranger did. It showed something simpler and more believable: the animal had moved through that landscape enough to respond to changes humans had overlooked. Caleb began keeping those small observations instead of dismissing them. One afternoon, Owen set the repaired radio on Caleb's desk. "They could not fix the casing," he said, "but it still works." Caleb turned it over in his hands. The scratches remained along one side. He clipped it to his belt and left the old bag, ribbon and all, in the top drawer. It no longer felt like evidence from a frightening day. It felt like a reminder to pay closer attention. Several weeks later, Caleb joined Dana on a short vehicle survey near the lower trails. He still walked with a brace, so they stayed close to the road. Near a clearing, Dana slowed the truck and pointed without speaking. Baku's group was moving through the trees about 80 yards away. Caleb remained inside the vehicle. He did not call out. He did not try to create another moment. Baku paused near the rear of the group and looked toward the road for a few seconds before continuing. Caleb rested one hand on the door and watched him disappear. The encounter was brief enough that anyone else might have missed its importance. Caleb did not. A month later, the reserve installed 2 additional soil markers near the ridge and rerouted part of the inspection path. The decision was based on safety data, not sentiment. Still, when Caleb saw the new route on the map, it followed almost the same line Baku had taken through the trees. He ran one finger along it, then folded the map carefully and placed it beside the radio. Outside the station window, the afternoon light had turned warm across the wet grass. Somewhere beyond the trees, a low gorilla call carried through the reserve, distant and ordinary, and this time Caleb simply smiled before returning to work. By early fall, Caleb was back on regular patrol, though he moved through the reserve differently than before. He still checked fences, logged storm damage, and carried the same repaired radio at his belt, but he no longer treated quiet stretches of trail as empty space. He noticed where leaves had been pressed flat, where branches had been moved, where animals chose one side of a path instead of the other. Most of those details meant nothing beyond ordinary movement. Caleb had learned to be comfortable with that. Not every mark needed an explanation. One cool afternoon, he reached the overlook above the old ridge and stopped beside the new safety marker. The repaired trail curved around the slope now, following firmer ground. He rested his hand on the wooden post and looked down at the place where the rain had changed everything. Grass had started growing across the damaged soil. From that distance, the ridge looked almost ordinary again. Caleb took the old yellow ribbon from his jacket pocket. He had carried a short piece of it for weeks without knowing why. Instead of tying it to the marker, he folded it once and slipped it back into his pocket. Some things did not need to become memorials. Dana found him there a few minutes later. She handed him a thermos cup of coffee and stood beside him without asking what he was thinking. For a while they listened to wind moving through the trees. "You still checking that radio twice a day?" she asked. Caleb looked down at the scratched casing on his belt. "3 times, he said. Dana smiled. Neither of them mentioned the rescue. They did not need to. Before they left, a soft rustling came from the lower brush. Caleb instinctively slowed. Through the trees, several gorillas were crossing a distant clearing. Baku appeared last, moving at an unhurried pace behind the group. There was no reason to believe he had noticed Caleb. The distance was too great, and Caleb made no sound. Still, he stayed where he was until every animal disappeared into the trees. Dana took 2 steps down the trail, then realized Caleb had not followed. She looked back. He was holding the thermos in one hand and touching the radio with the other. "Ready?" she asked. Caleb nodded, but before turning away, he glanced once more at the empty clearing. That became enough for him. Over the following months, the reserve returned to its normal rhythm. Storms came and passed. New rangers joined the team. Trail cameras were moved. The temporary holding equipment used that day went back into storage with hundreds of other pieces of field gear. Baku continued traveling with his group, appearing in photographs now and then, sometimes close to the service trail and sometimes miles away. Caleb stopped saving every image. He kept only one. It was not the clearest photograph and not the most dramatic. Baku was partly turned away, walking beneath tall trees while a smaller gorilla moved ahead of him. Nothing unusual was happening. Caleb printed that picture and placed it inside his locker door at the station. Months later, Owen noticed it while looking for spare batteries. "That the one?" he asked. Caleb followed his gaze. "Yes," he said. Owen waited, perhaps expecting more. Caleb simply closed the locker and clipped the radio onto his belt. Outside, Dana was calling the team for the afternoon route check. Caleb stepped through the station door into cool sunlight, then paused when his radio gave a brief crackle. He smiled, tested the button once, and started down the trail. Thank you for watching until the end of the video.